Well, thank you and welcome to everybody. I'm glad you showed up to listen to what I have to tell you. And the first thing I wanted to say to you is I'm not a soil scientist. Just let's get that out front right away. I'm not a soil physicist. I'm not a soil chemist. I'm not involved in the formation of soils. I did, however, work with soil ecology and mostly on the small insects and such. So I know a little bit about that, but that was, 2 or 3 lifetimes ago. So what I'm hoping to do is talk a little bit about a topic that's kind of complicated, about a subject that we don't usually notice or consider, or for that matter, understand all that well, which is soil and the things that live in it a little bit. Give you an idea for why it's important and why it's a challenge to figure out what to do as a result of some of the things that are going on. I also say, feel free to ask questions as we go along, and I'll see if I can come up with a reasonable answer along the way. So let's see if this thing actually works now. A couple major points I'd like you to keep in mind as we go through and start off with is that native plants evolve together with the physical environment and with other organisms. Unlike invasive plants, which come in and sort of upset the apple cart, native plants and their environment, all the organisms kind of evolve together. They play well together, at least they know how to play together. So that's something we keep in mind, is that what's supposed to be here has been here for a long time. The other thing to keep in mind, though, is part of their physical environment is the soil. And the soil is really a complex environment. It's a lot of very interesting communities. It's a complex ecosystem. And there's a lot of moving parts in there that are not entirely well understood, which makes it, again, a fascinating area to work with, but also a challenge sometimes to figure out what's going on and what can we do as a response to things. So the first thing is to ask the question of what is soil? It's not just dirt. There's a lot going on in there. We have, of course, the physical aspects of soil. We also have biological elements as well. As far as the physical elements, you can see them listed on the slide. It's texture, structure, the mineral content, the organic components, and then, of course, water. We do have water occasionally, and I got some today where I live. So what is soil texture? Basically, the simplest thing about soil texture is the percentage of sand and silt and clay that you have. It's important because that helps us to determine how much water can be taken into the soil, absorbed, how much water can be held in the soil, for how long, how well can it be tilled, how friable is it, can you move it around easily, what's the aeration status. All of these things influence the soil fertility, how well plants are able to take nutrients, other resources from the soil and bring it into themselves and make use of it. We've got coarse sandy soils that are very easy to till. They are good aeration for growth of the roots, but they dry out quickly and they lose a lot of nutrients through leaching. On the other hand, you have high clay soils. They have small particles. They fit together rather tightly. That plays havoc with water. They're difficult to wet. When they get wet, they're difficult to drain, and heavy soils are difficult to till. So that's a little bit about the texture. And the other thing I want to say right now, a lot of you have seen the soil texture triangle, the percentages of the silt and the clay and the sand, and the bottom line here is don't panic. There's not going to be a quiz at the end of all this. This is just to give you an idea for how do we come up with these names like clay loam and silty clay loam and sandy clay loam and silt loam and all that kind of stuff. It's percentages of the silt and the clay and the sand. On the other hand, these primary particles, the sand, the silt, the clay, often group together and get clumped in aggregates, and it's the arrangement of these clumps into certain patterns that we call structure. So you've got texture, which is what percentage you have of silt and clay and sand, and then you have the how they get arranged, and that's what we call structure. And not just the slide here is just to give you kind of an idea for the different kinds of structures if you haven't seen them before. Again, this is not going to be a quiz on this thing, but we do have real scientific names like massive and blocky. So that's how soil scientists will talk about the structure of a soil, but it has nothing to do with the clay content necessarily or the sand content, but how they get together. So having said all that, we can move on to the biological aspect of soil, because this is the medium in which everything else is the foundation for everything that's happening in the biological element. I want to introduce, however, the concept of the keystone species. Keystone species are species that help to define, say, an ecosystem. Without keystone species, an ecosystem would not be like it is now. It might not even exist. If you look on the web and look for examples of keystone species, you'll find things like gray wolf, orca whales, polar bears, maybe ponderosa pine, mangrove trees for swamps. Occasionally you see something like a honeybee that they'll throw in there for good measure. But everything you'll notice there are big organisms, things you can see. They're kind of hard to miss. You know, sequoia trees are kind of out there in front of you. Same thing with a polar bear. You're very much aware of a polar bear or an orca whale if you're face to face with one, or a great white shark. But there's a lot of other species out there that are not obvious. They have a huge role and a huge impact on the ecosystem. And that's sort of the thing I want to look at. In the soil, we're not talking about massive shark-like organisms. We're talking about smaller organisms that have a huge impact. And if they're not there, things just don't work the way you're supposed to be. So moving into the biological elements, what actually lives in the soil, we have insects, of course. And of course, insects, I'm also going to include the non-insects, the other arthropods, the scorpions, the spiders, the small things you probably never seen or heard of, pauropods, symphyla, and stuff like that. But two big ones that are really fall into the keystone, excuse me, species category are ants and termites. Now, most of the time, we don't think about ants unless they're on the kitchen counter or in the bathroom in a line, or maybe they've gotten into the cat food or the dog food bowl. You'll see them out there when you're walking around, but we don't think much about them unless they actually get into our own way. But they have a huge impact on what's going on out there. Ants modify soil. By burrowing in and making their colony, their nest, and moving around, they decrease what they call the bulk density of the soil. They create burrows, they create holes. That allows water to soak in. It allows oxygen, air, to get in. They also increase the concentrations of carbon and nitrogen in the soil by bringing food back into the nest. And then you have waste, all organisms are going to have waste, which leads to all kinds of decomposition. And they also help to mix the soil, which has a huge impact on what's going to be happening out there. In addition, something we really don't think much about when it comes to insects is they help to maintain a nest temperature. We don't think of insects usually in terms of heat. We see them maybe warming up in an early morning in the sun before they take off. But a lot of the social insects particularly can get together, and in clumps they can produce a lot of heat. That's certainly true for ants. It's also true for honeybees. It's true for hornets. I had, as a student, the experience of being able to dig up a hornet's nest that was in the ground. The kind of you have paper nest hanging, but it was the paper nest was in the ground. And I will hasten to add that the hornets were dead. We had just eliminated them. But digging them up, this was an entomology class, you could feel the heat in the nest. And if you scooped them up in your hand, as I did, and other students as well, I wasn't completely stupid, we were able to feel the heat of these hornets. So the mass is there. It has something that you can transfer and be aware of. And just by the way, don't squeeze dead hornets because you can still get stung. And the venom is still there and you will feel it. Just take my word for this. So, if you're ever in this position, admire, don't squeeze. So having said that though, the heat has an effect on the soil because that will affect the diversity of the microbes that are going to be there, the fungi, other things that are going on, and that affects the decomposition, which then feeds back into the looping of the nutrients in the soil. So here's a keystone species. Ants modify the soil considerably, and that has an effect on the plants that are out there. Another one that we don't think about too often, termites, unless of course you've been ready to buy a house or you're trying to sell a house, or your house is maybe afflicted by them and you have to get rid of them. But termites are all around us in the soil. Most of the time, we don't see them unless a rain like today, they come out and they fly around and looking for new nests. And then if you have a swimming pool, they'll be in your swimming pool, or they might get into the vent and they get into your cooler and you see a few. But for the most part, we don't see them. But like ants, they tunnel, and that helps to make the soil more porous and allows water to get in, allows oxygen to get in. One of the things that's kind of interesting too is that in the Jornada experimental range, where there were just some experimental plots going on, and they eliminated in this one plot the termites, the short grass cover completely disappeared. And I don't think that's a complete coincidence. There's definitely an interplay between what the termites are doing and what's growing on the surface, because termites here in the desert help to regulate the flow of carbon and nitrogen. And they also process up the half of the dead roots and litter that we find in grasslands. So there's a lot of stuff that's going on. It's dependent on the activity that these folks, these social cockroaches, as we call them in the entomology world, help to process. They're a very important piece of the puzzle. Other things that live in the soil, worms. Worms are, that's a broad category. Most people, when you say worms, are probably going to think of segmented worms, the annelid worms, earthworms, and we don't usually think of them in this part of the world, but they do exist here in New Mexico. You know, you don't have to go to Michigan, you don't have to go to Oklahoma, you don't have to go to someplace where they have soil and occasionally moisture. We have them here as well. They are like the ants, like the termites, they burrow through the soil, they help to mix the soil, they will ingest a lot of organic matter and digestion, and at the end they get rid of their casts, which is another nice way of saying earthworm poo, and that helps to enrich the soil and is part of the cycle. Other worms are the nematode worms, roundworms. They're both free living and parasitic. When we think of parasitic forms in animals, we can think of like hookworms. In people, you can think of filarial worms that will get Loa elephantiasis and diseases of that nature. Root knot nematode disease is caused by parasitic nematodes. But most of them are free living. Most of them are also pretty small. They're not like the horror movies that you see with these giant things that come through the soil and devour whole automobiles. They're really small. They're very hard to see. They're just everywhere. They're part of the important part of the ecosystem in the sense that they are eating algae, they're eating microbes. They themselves are part of the food cycle. Arthropods, small things are eating them. So it's just part of the, they're out there. And that's what I wanted to say. They're very, very common, just not seen and not thought about. We also have semi-aquatic invertebrates out there, believe it or not. Even here in the desert, when we get rains like we had today, you get a film of water on the particles of the soil, which can be enough to support some surprising invertebrates. You also, if you have flooded areas, like on some of our playa areas, the beach areas, you get ephemeral ponds and you can get a lot of aquatic and semi-aquatic organisms showing up, including this little baby. Now you can see rotifers. Rotifers are usually found in ponds, streams, lakes, but you can find them out here in the desert. I've seen them on the Jornada experimental range on some of those ephemeral ponds. They're not so, I just wanted to point out that they're out there. They're just part of the milieu of what we find. But now, getting into some things that really are important. Oops. Okay, biological crusts, soil crusts, biocrusts. Sometimes they're called algal crusts, that's what I used to call them. But they are very important. They're sort of the skin of the soil. They help to hold the soil together on the surface. They lend stability to the soil, and they also affect an awful lot of the soil nutrient cycling and carbon cycling, nitrogen. We probably don't notice them much. When you're out walking, you might see something that looks like this. And it's only maybe a couple centimeters thick. it's not a single thing. It's many organisms together. It's a diverse community. Lots of different kinds of organisms there. You have cyanobacteria, which is the blue-green algae. You have regular green algae, you have bacteria, you have fungi, you have larger organisms. You've got mosses, you've got lichens, which are themselves a composite type of organism. And you got microarthropods, which is something I used to study about 3 lifetimes ago. So a lot of stuff going on there. They're not uniform. They are different kinds of organisms in different parts of the world, but they're very important because they allow stability of the soil. And another thing to keep in mind is they cover, in the drylands, I've seen a range of 40 to 100% of the ground surface in drylands. Take your pick as to where we are, but drylands are an awful large part of the terrestrial surface of the world. So they have a huge impact just by being there an awful lot. And the last bullet mentions that you get global scale impacts because there's so much of it out there. And that affects water cycling, nutrient cycling, the whole carbon cycle. So this is a very important piece of what's going on out there. And we're trying to figure out what in the world is going on. There are people working in Arizona as well as New Mexico and other places to figure out which species are there, because they're not all the same species. Which are the important species? You might say which are the keystone species of this group. If we have algal, the biocrusts that have been removed, how can we restore them? What's the necessary species? Do we have just one that we need to inoculate the soil with and it will be sufficient? Do we have to have a combination? If we just have one or two, will the others somehow show up? A lot of things we're trying to tease apart and understand so that we can restore and keep the soil healthy, in a sense, keep the ecosystem going. Oops, that is not working. Here's a piece of the algal crust picked up, and you can see this is only a couple centimeters, but you also see it's not uniform. You've got these tendrils hung down, you've got fungi in there, you've got lichens in there, you've got a variety of organisms that are very complicated, very complex, but also very important for structural reasons. Like I said, it's sort of the skin of the soil, helping to hold it together. Now we move on to fungi. Now plants have a lot of symbiotic relationships, but particularly with mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi are fungi that inhabit and interact with the plants at the root level, and they've co-evolved. To give you an example, here is a strawberry root. The black or the dark color in there are mycorrhizal fungi that have entered in and have taken up residence in the root of this strawberry plant. And this little thread coming out, the hyphae, goes out into the environment. The fungi then use that to help gather extra water, to gather nutrients, minerals and such from the soil that comes in, and then the excess spills out into the root and the plant gets to use it. The plant, on the other hand, is doing photosynthetic activity, making sugars and then other carbohydrates, which go down to the roots, and the fungi get a chance to use that. So it's kind of a win situation back and forth. Mycorrhizal fungi, they have this effect of extending the root zone, in a sense. The roots by themselves get a long way. The hyphae of the fungi get it out even more, greater surface area. It's a lot like using the towel. Your bath towel's got all those little threads in them that give extra surface area, that absorb water. The same sort of things happening here with these roots. Mycorrhizal fungi are rather common in the soils. They're widely distributed. I was reading that it's about 80% of all the plants that have been examined, if I can believe what I read, have some sort of mycorrhizal interaction with fungi, a symbiotic reaction. And that includes an awful lot of the important agricultural, economically important plants. You see the list that's here: pecans, alfalfa, onions, chilies, apples, corn, cotton, wheat, Sudan grass, just to name some. That's a pretty impressive list, pretty important plants that are out there. And all these, by the way, are grown here in New Mexico. So it has an economic impact and importance that way. By the way, just an incidental thing, next time you're at a cocktail party, you can tell them that one group that does not have mycorrhizal fungi are the Brassicaceae, the cabbages. That's the Brussels sprouts, kale, broccoli, cauliflower. Whatever reason, they don't seem to have the mycorrhizal fungi, but nearly all the rest of them do. And like I said, they help to form a secondary root system, which helps to extend the reach of the roots. So they're really very important for these plants. And kind of a picture to kind of show the hyphae extending out here to give you how it extends that surface area so you can gather in more stuff. If you're a plant, that's exactly what you need. Where you find them is usual suspects in the soil would be the temperature, what nutrients are out there, what is the composition in terms of sand and soil, sand and silt and clay. You've got various exudations from roots. Sometimes there'll be the favorable things like maybe some sugars, but maybe it's things that help to suppress other plants. You've got a lot of things you got to take into account. What kind of moisture is out there, how acid or alkaline is the soil, what kind of competition. So no surprises in that respect. The mycorrhizal fungi, as I said, are essential for a lot of plants, including desert plants and particularly grasses. Many are species specific. If you don't have the fungi, the grasses have a hard time in the area. And it kind of evolved together, and some of them really need each other, or you really have a problem and you're not going to flourish. Many years ago, I hate to say at this point, but when I was a postdoc here at New Mexico State University, came here originally, one of my fellow postdocs, Dr. John Zach, who's about to retire from Texas Tech University after he's been an associate dean and a department head, worked on the mycorrhizal interactions with some of our desert plants out here as part of trying to understand what was going on, how teasing apart, how do they interact, and could you somehow bring them back together again if that link was broken and reestablish it so that we could have these plants reestablished in an area that's been disturbed. And it's really been complex. It really wasn't an easy answer. There isn't actually a good answer, not that I've heard at least. So another thing to keep in mind, many of the economically important plants have commercial inoculum available. By that I mean they have commercially developed strains of the mycorrhizal fungi that can be packaged together with the seeds, and you can get it into the soil along with the seed. You can coat the seeds in some of these cases with these. So when the seed germinates, the fungal spores are there. You have the infection, they're ready to go. They interact. The non-economically important plants, the non-agricultural plants, the non-important landscape plants, I'm thinking of desert grasses as an example, do not have commercial inoculum developed. So if you break that link, there's not an easy way to get it back. We can't go out and bring some in. And one of the things that's going on with researchers these days is trying to figure out, can we develop an inoculum? Can we get it specifically oriented to certain plants that we'd like to have restored in the area? And how do we accomplish that? That, again, is not a straightforward situation. So we know environments can be disturbed. Drought, we've been in a drought for more than a decade here in the West. No surprise to anybody who's on this broadcast. Fire, we watched the fire devastate parts of the mountains here in the state of New Mexico and our neighbors. All this has been exacerbated by shifts in the climatic pattern. Some of it's been by overgrazing. That can be by livestock like cattle, but it can also be from wildlife. And if you have certain years where food is really poor, you get bad grazing and browsing, they can put an impact on an environment as well. And of course, human activities, it can be something like putting in a house, it could be digging up a garden. You could have agricultural fields, you could have a waste power plant, you could pave a parking lot, or you just have a path that you walk on repeatedly, compact the ground and get rid of the plants. So you've got all kinds of ways of disturbances. And what does that do to our environment here? Well, if the environment is heavily disturbed, the fungi that are used for these symbiotic relationships, the mycorrhizal fungi, might also disappear. Or they might go down to a level where there's not enough of them to make a sustainable interaction with plants. It's kind of a chicken and egg. You got to have both of them. And if one's gone, how do you get them back in together, especially if you don't really understand very well how they work together? Native plants, as a result, might not be able to reestablish themselves because you've broken the chain. How do we get that back in? And another thing to keep in mind is the disturbed area might end up at a different long-term equilibrium point. There's more than one equilibrium point that's potentially available to our environments. It's a little bit like that game we had back in the 70s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, where you had the little metal ball and you were trying to turn the wheels and get it to move around and go from one hole to another hole. And it wasn't easy to get it out of the hole. If it did get out of the hole, it might not go to the hole you were aiming for, it might go somewhere else. This is a little bit like the environment. You've got a stable situation. Once it finally gets disturbed enough, it might go to another configuration, and that's hard to get out of sometimes. So you've got that kind of thing that we're working with sometimes. If we really disturb the environment, we might not be at a place where if you just remove what you think is the disturbing factor, it might not just go back. If you think that cattle are eating the grass and you exclude the cattle from an area, will the grass come back? Maybe, maybe not. It depends on the kind of and the extent of the disturbance that we're talking about, whether or not we've broken the chain with what the plant needs to be able to reestablish. If it was only being eaten and there's still a lot of plant left, you might be able to do it. And I've seen plenty of examples where fields have had exclusion of livestock and they've restored themselves up around north of Carrizozo, where we have a science center. What's the little town? Guys, in the middle of nowhere, but it's restored itself. But other places, not so. And I'm thinking of the Jornada experimental range as an example for that. So a lot of this research that is, yeah, thank you, Corona. Marissa would know, and I should know. I used to be there off and on. The research that we're undergoing right now is trying to better understand what's going on with these mycorrhizal interactions, as well as what's going on with the biocrusts of the, teasing that apart and trying to get a look at them, understanding them in a reductionist way, what's happening with this piece, what's happening with that piece, and then trying to bring them back together again and see if it will work. And that's where we have some interesting challenges. So what does this mean perhaps for restoration work? We're trying to put pieces back together again and make it like it was. Can we do it? And if we have some policies, what are the things we need to consider when we're thinking of what we're going to do? Back in 1986, Barb Salich got a master's degree from the biology department at New Mexico State University and looked, among other things, at historic pictures and went back to the same sites to see what they're like today and tried to see what the difference was, what were some of the factors that accounted for some of the differences you saw. Unfortunately, this is the best scan I could possibly make from the original thesis that's in the library, which is actually sitting by my feet right now. The library will get it back. I apologize for the quality of what you're looking at, but you see here's the mountains here, and you get the same peaks in the lower picture. Basically, you're looking at the same place. Where this is located, for those of you who are interested in that, this is on the Jornada experimental range. It is, if you know where the West Well is, this is 1 mile south of the West Well, looking southwest from there. Now, up here, this is Black Grama, Bouteloua areophyta. Down below, same site, 1984, so that's what, 46 years later? We're looking at not grama grass. I can tell you that right now. It's quite a difference. Another picture, and this one is also on the Jornada experimental range. This is up at the Red Lake Well, approximately a mile west of there, looking to the northeast. And you can see the grass is up here with some of the cattle. Down below, 45 years later, 1984, you see a real increase in honey mesquite, Prosopis granulosa. So a huge change. Taking out the cattle does not mean the grass is automatically going to come back. In fact, you see right now there are no cattle, but you also don't see any grass, no grama grass anyway. So one of the things that happened is USDA scientists, Lee Buffington and Carlton Herbal, in 1965 published an analysis of vegetation changes in this area, looking from between 1858 and 1963 from historical records and what they were able to look at on certain plots in the Jornada range. And some interesting things come out of that. Back in 1858, the records indicate that there was what we consider good grass present on more than 90% of the area that they looked at in the Jornada Range. A little more than a century later, less than a quarter of that area had what was considered to be good grass. We're talking mostly the grama, black grama, blue grama, that kind of thing. In 1858, a little more than 6,000 acres had extensive mesquite cover. By 1963, that area had increased to more than 60,000 acres being dominated by mesquite. Half of that increase occurred after 1928, which raises the question, what happened in 1928 that exacerbated, sped that up? Well, it turns out a couple things happened. The Jornada experimental range put in stock tanks. Before the stock tanks were there, the cattle would go through an area, but they wouldn't stay in that area for an extended period of time because they didn't have the water sources. You put the stock tanks out there, now cattle can go into an area and stay in that area for an extended period of time. And that puts a lot more pressure on the grass and other things that they're eating. But something else that happens, well, when you're talking about a system, there are all kinds of things happening. Cattle will take care of mesquite seeds, and they will spread mesquite seeds from the areas where mesquite are dominant into the grassland areas. They do this by eating them, and of course, when you have cattle dung, you have mesquite seeds. Mesquite seeds get further distributed more quickly than you would have otherwise. You put a lot of pressure on the mesquite, or rather on the grasses, and you find out one more thing. When mesquite gets established, grasses don't really compete well with them. So you have cattle in an area bringing in mesquite seeds in a higher rate. They're eating more of the grass, so putting a greater pressure on the grasses there. And you get the combination of things so that when it's all said and done, you have seed dispersal along with heavy grazing. And of course, the periodic droughts that this area has always been known for. Not fire, but droughts. Seems to be a major factor for why we see this quick increase, relatively quick increase in shrubs generally, in the mesquite in this particular instance. So there's an interplay of a lot of things. So what I'm really trying to tell you here is, in this little overview of the soil ecology, is it's a system. There are a lot of things that are going on. What's the take-home message from all of this? It's complicated. All systems are complicated. Even simple systems are complex. And the soil is not a simple system. It's one of these things where anytime you got a system, you've got kinds of things interacting, you try to tease them apart, you look at them in isolation. But once you start putting them back together, you start having things interacting with each other in ways that we don't always anticipate, ways that we can't yet predict, knowing what we know. And the other thing I've learned over the years from ecology is you can never do just one thing. There's always more than one thing going on out there. And if you've ever tried to solve simultaneous equations, you know even the simplest ones are a little bit complicated. And when you start moving up the scale, then things get complicated really quickly, and I give up, frankly. So this is the thing I just want to leave with you is, it's like with the human system. We can look at the endocrine system, we can look at the various hormones in our body, we can look at what's going on with insulin, we can look at what's going on with growth hormone, we can look at all the different things individually, but then when you put them together, we get interactions. The interactions with feedback loops, subtleties, and more than one connection and more than one cycle makes it so that we can't always predict when a medicine goes into a person's body what it's going to do. And what it does in me and what it does in you may not be the same thing. What it does in one population and another population may not be the same thing. It's the same thing with the soil. It's very complicated. It's trying to tease it apart. We got people trying to do it because we depend on the soil. This is the foundation for everything that's growing out here. So it's worth it, which goes back to the whole business about policy. If we're trying to make policy, we should be careful about making cookie cutter policy, because this is not a cookie cutter situation. There's a lot of moving parts. So with that cheerful note, if you have any questions, if you have any comments, I'm happy to hear them. If you have any answers, I would be happy to hear them too. So again, we thank you for your indulgence. That's it from my end at the moment.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Loring. This very interesting. A lot of good information there. Just on a personal note, I have been from a distance, so to speak, have been following the ecology of the Chihuahuan Desert here in our area ever since the turn of the 20th century. And Dr. Walt Whitford, you're familiar with, I'm sure. He indoctrinated me and told me how everything was working. And so I've been very interested in this. I've had to do plant surveys and so forth for endangered species and so on. So I've been very familiar. I was given, after our experimental range tour we had last month, and I'm losing track of time. And the book written by Fred Ayers on the experimental range, I found very fascinating. So yeah, this is cool. And I don't know if it's worth mentioning a couple, 3 places in New Mexico where what you described, the loss of our grass and more mesquite. There's 2 or 3 places in this southern New Mexico where that hasn't happened. And it's amazing to see what the difference is, like the Otero Mesa, as well as the Boot Heel and the Gray Ranch. There's a couple of examples where this didn't happen. So I found those very fascinating. Is there anybody else in the group now that has questions or comments for Dr. Loring?
I do. Oh, go ahead.
Marcy?
Okay, well, let's see. When people talk about the grass that used to be here, they describe it as you know, a very tall grass. And the only species that I know of is that's that big, that tall, is the giant saccaton, which we have a little of near the Corralitos and Las Uvas mountains, but nowhere else that I've really been aware of around in you know, around 30 or 40 miles of here. So is that was that the main grass that was actually here, the giant saccaton? Or was it other species? I'm sure there were other species, but when they talk about the tall grass that used to be here, was giant saccaton spread out more?
The truthful answer is I don't know. I will say up front that I'm a zoologist. I recognize plants 9 times out of 10. And I know there are people on this listening in who actually have a lot of expertise about the plants, who might actually be able to answer that question in a way that means something. I know what giant saccaton is. I know what you're talking about, but I don't know if that was the main plant that was here that was tall back when the early descriptions were.
Yeah.
And a side note too, what Gil Sorgs mentioned, Walt Whitford, he was the reason I came down to New Mexico State University in the first place. I worked as a postdoc in his laboratory.
Wow. He was my advisor back in '68.
Small world.
Long time ago when he first got here. Yeah. A neat guy.
Yes.
Okay, I'm done then. Yeah.
So I know that there were some people here who could maybe answer that question.
Is there someone?
Okay, I'll try it. Ask with a different tone.
Normally, this part of the world is considered shortgrass prairie because of the typical rainfall, the lack of rainfall out here. The tallgrass prairies were further east, where you had various humidity and moisture fronts coming in from additional areas. But I wanted to ask Dr. Loring if there's been any work on, again, some of these areas that have some considerable good grass left. Has there been any work trying to transplant to restoration sites some of the biocrust that may be there already, to see if that can take in some of these areas that have been degraded?
The answer to that is it's underway currently. There's a fellow whose name Ferman, I'm trying to think of his last name, over at I think Arizona State, who's been working on this, and he's trying to come over and try an inoculum. I think it's mostly based on cyanobacteria to see if that will help the take. He's working in soils in Arizona as well and coming over here. I do not know where what the status is. I was talking with Dr. Akasha Faced last week, who is involved in some of that research, and I haven't, and all I know is it's in progress. I do not know yet what the success is. So that's one of the things they're trying to tease apart and find out what is the important component and how do we make it work. So I can't answer your question directly. I just know it's underway.
Thank you.
Any others?
Yes, I
Is it-
have a question. One time several years ago, I heard that there was this spray they were using to kill creosote with, and it left the grasses alone. And I was wondering if that experiment ever worked. Or people are using it to clear grazing land to try to get the grasses to grow back.
That's a complicated question, but as far as the salt cedar is concerned, they've done that sort of thing. And it has worked to some extent. Actually, biological control seems to work even better with that, with certain kinds of beetles that just chow down on it and keep chowing down on it until it finally just gives up and dies. Because if you can chain that or you can spray it, it doesn't seem to work really very effectively. The problem, again, if we're trying to get rid of the mesquite and other shrubs in the desert here, is you can pull them out, but then you've got, how do you get the grasses back in? Because the grasses need, like I say, some of these other elements to be able to get it well established. And that's really what some of the challenge really is. It's not so much removing the mesquite, although that's a challenge, but you take away the mesquite doesn't automatically mean grasses are going to come back in. And it's how do we, what's the steps that are necessary?
Creosote was.
I'm sorry, creosote.
Yeah.
Yeah, they sprayed the creosote bush, and creosote bush is a tough bugger. That's really what I want to tell you about them.
Some hormonal based thing or something that made it very specific to creosote.
That I don't know. That's outside of my knowledge base.
Okay.
I'm aware of a couple places that spraying of those creosote scrub areas has been done. One was way over on the western part of the state, west even of Silver City. And another one was just not too far from Las Cruces here and part of the National Monument south of Interstate 10. I don't know. I looked at it and I couldn't tell what the difference is. It's a tough one. Creosote is just small leaves. It doesn't absorb the herbicide very well. And so it's like Dr. Loring said, it's difficult, very difficult.
And nothing likes to eat it very much either.
Right.
It's not palatable to most of the insects.
That's right.
Dr. Loring, we're some of the new people that moved into the Las Cruces in the last few years, so many. And we moved into a new home that has the, I forgot how to say it, calcareous clay, where the ancient bones and seashells form this hard surface. And then, of course, it's been impacted with the new construction as well. I've heard that zinc and iron can help the soil somewhat. What is your take on that?
Well, what we use in our own garden area here is ironite and all, but we're getting into an area, I'm afraid I really don't know enough about the chemistry of the soil to be able to give you the kind of answers. I know there are a few people here who do master gardener kind of stuff, and they probably know a heck of a lot more about this than I do. I mean, what you're finding right now is where my limits are. And
Sure.
what you're talking about is something I can't give you more than just waving my hands, but I'm happy to do that for you.
Well, actually, I found one of the most important meetings I've heard of this group, and I really enjoyed it. So that's okay. I learned a lot from you. And maybe someone can tell me, the zinc and the iron are micro whatevers. And they're supposed to be helping the soil get back to its original health. And if anyone has any comments, you can let me know on that.
Are there any other questions I can evade?
There are some questions in the chat. I don't know if Gil wants to read those off, but there are some.
Yes, let's see. One of them is the Earth about 60 years away from depletion of all the topsoils is accurate. The short answer is I don't know, and I don't think anybody else really knows either. It's a serious concern, however, because we are impacting what's going on. But to put a number like that on, I have no idea if that's accurate or not. But it's definitely a concern that we need to keep in mind, along with everything else. What is happening to the topsoil? You know, we've got aridification, air desertification going on, a lot of things being disrupted and impacted. So it's a concern, but I don't know if that's accurate. How successful is Hornado Range in renewing the grasses? The short answer is not very, as far as I can see. It's got the same problems that I remember when I came here in 1984, for the most part. You know, trying to restore the grasses in the areas where they've been just completely disrupted. It just, it's a tough thing. It's just not working that much. So the Hornado looks an awful lot like it did, 40 years ago, something like that. So I don't know what the answer is going to be in the future, but right now, all we can do is manage what we've got for the most part. And then Marissa asks, why do I think the brassicas don't seem to need or have mycorrhizal relationships? And the short answer to that is I have no idea. In German, ich habe keine Ahnung. I haven't the vaguest. Just brassicas are special, what can I say?
You go out and you ride along the Corralitos Ranch Road out there, and you climb any of the little hills around there. You look around, it's flat enough to see masses and masses of creosote, but then my battery is running. But then in the arroyos, all the creosote has stopped and the grasses are there. And so, the grasses are coating the lower playas and the long arroyos that are running from the playas. It's solid grass, and there's no creosote growing in that area. So my conclusion is that it just needs more water, and the grasses would be strong enough to outcompete the creosote if there was enough water there. At least that's what it appears to me. It's creosote all over except in the arroyos and the lower playas, and then it's full of grass. And so just add water.
Well, yes, but if we add water out on the Hornado Range outside of the arroyo system, it doesn't seem to work, because we did that for part of our studies way back when I was still a practicing scientist, or at least thought I was. We would do water amendments along with various other things. And it didn't really affect, at least in those areas where the disturbance was already pretty bad. That didn't seem to be the thing that was a big deal. So I'd like to see that area on the Corralitos Ranch Road sometime and just take a look.
Okay.
Dr. Woodford told me there's two limiting factors for grasses to grow here. And water is one, yes, but nitrogen is the other. Our soils are pretty poor in nitrogen here, and grass needs nitrogen.
Right. And as I said, one of the things we found in addition to nitrogen, and Walt Whitford was absolutely correct, nitrogen is a huge limiting factor in these soils. And I did not talk about that. But then again, we get into these biological aspects that I was talking about with the mycorrhizal fungi that are also necessary for them to flourish. So it's a complex picture. And
That's right.
unfortunately, there's no magic bullet you've got to have a whole holster full of different kinds of bullets.
Right. Any others?
Hi, this is Marie, and I'm on the telephone. And I had a quick question. Hopefully, it'll be a quick answer too. With regards to things such as small oil spills, maybe gasoline or motor oil that's in the cryptobiotic type soil, is attenuation, are you aware that attenuation is one way to have the soil remediate as opposed to going in and plowing it out or backhoeing it out?
Yes, I've heard that, and I have some doubts about how effective that really is. You can have plants
Okay.
pull up some of these things, but then you've got the plants with the stuff in it. And unless the plants can break it down, you've got another issue. How do you get rid of either the plant or the biocrust? And then you got a problem if you get rid of the biocrust, which is important in itself. So the best thing to do is not have the spill in the first place, I guess. But once you've got the spill, you've got a real problem. We had a spill at one of our
Okay.
off-campus plant centers, and basically we had to get rid of the soil. There just was no other way to
Yep.
do it.
Okay. Thank you.
Mhm.
Very interesting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Any others?
Etwas noch? Anything else?
John, do you have a word to say? You look like you wanted to say something.
Yeah, I did. It slipped my mind though, but this is very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lauren.
Well,
Okay,
Thank
I just
you. We really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Thank you.
yeah, thank you so much. There's some awesome information there.
Can I ask one last question?
Sure, Joan.
Yeah, I wanted to follow the conversation about the correlitos patterns of the grasses in the lower areas. I see those too every time I go. And I think those low areas are filled with alkali sacchaton. And what I've been told is that the cattle do not prefer the alkali sacchaton to the extent that it is a very thick grassland in the lower areas. Is that a correct analysis, that the cattle aren't eating the alkali sacchaton, which are growing alkali lowland areas in the, and again, it's right where Marcia's talking about out in the correlitos.
I know that cattle don't prefer the alkali sacchaton. I don't know to what extent they'll eat it if they're hungry. I will say that my specialty were insects, and cattle have fewer than 6 legs, and they got a skeleton on the inside of their body. And I kind of am not entirely sure about some of the things that they do, but I do know that they will eat it. They don't prefer it. So I don't know to what extent that interplay is coming into play here.
Okay, so they may not be as hungry as we think, because the grasslands are pretty strong out there. Thank you for
Yes.
your answer.
Yeah.
If I could add a little bit as a former rancher myself, cattle do have preferences in their grasses that they eat. But as a general rule of thumb, almost any grass they'll eat if it's young and tender, green. But when it gets old and dries up, that's when they don't prefer it too well. Okay. Any more?
Thank you for your indulgence, everyone. Appreciate it.
Thank
You're
Thank you very
welcome,
much.
Dr. Wayne.